The verdict that shattered everything. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, their buzzing hum filling the silent courtroom like distant wasps trapped behind glass. The polished oak floors gleamed, reflecting the pale faces of those gathered to watch justice, or whatever version of it they believed in, be served. Detective Ethan Callahan sat at the defendant's table, his broad shoulders squared, his hands folded together so tightly his knuckles shone white. His once proud frame, built from years of chasing down criminals and pulling long shifts on cold city nights, was swallowed by the ill-fitting navy jumpsuit of a man condemned. His badge, once worn proudly on his belt, had been replaced by cold metal cuffs, his wrists chained to the table. Beside him, his attorney's pen clicked uselessly against a yellow legal pad, the ink dried from weeks of futile arguments. The air was too still, the weight of the moment pushing down on everyone in the room, like a lid sealed tight over a boiling pot. In the back row, Samantha Callahan, Ethan's only daughter, sat with her hands trembling in her lap. The polished fingernails she used to keep perfect were chewed down to ragged edges. Her breath came shallow, almost non-existent, as she leaned forward, every muscle in her body drawn so tight it felt like she might snap apart if anyone so much as touched her. The past 10 months had unraveled her world thread by thread. The headlines had gone from calling her father a hero to a monster overnight. Decorated detective charged with cold-blooded murder. There had been no grace period, no benefit of the doubt. The evidence was damning. DNA under the victim's fingernails. Gunshot residue on Ethan's hands. Security footage, grainy but clear enough, of a man matching his height and build fleeing the alley where Councilman James Porter was found with 2 bullets in his chest. The jury had taken just 2 days to deliberate. Samantha hadn't slept. Not after the trial began. Not after the verdict came down. Not after the nightmares started of her father, shackled to a chair in some cold room, waiting to die for something she knew he couldn't have done. The jury foreman stood, his paper trembling, but his voice clear. In the matter of the state versus Detective Ethan Callahan, on the charge of first-degree murder, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap, louder than any gunshot Samantha had ever heard. It felt as though the world cracked open beneath her feet, sending her free-falling into nothingness. Her father didn't flinch. His hands remained folded, his jaw tight, his expression carved into granite. No outrage, no disbelief, just a terrible stillness that was far worse than anger. Samantha couldn't breathe. She clutched the back of the bench in front of her, nails digging into the wood until they splintered. Her vision blurred, and her body refused to move. The judge's gavel slammed down, the final note in a song Samantha never wanted to hear again. Detective Callahan, having been found guilty of first-degree murder, this court hereby sentences you to death by lethal injection. Execution to be carried out within 30 days. The room erupted. The victim's family sobbed, the press swarmed, cameras flashing and reporters barking questions, none of them caring about the real story. None of them caring about her. Samantha barely remembered pushing through the crowd, her ears ringing as though underwater. Hands reached for her, reporters desperate for a quote, a soundbite, something to exploit. A microphone was thrust toward her face. How does it feel to be the daughter of a murderer? The words hit her like a slap. Her knees buckled, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse entirely. Her father, the man who had held her hand through scraped knees and whispered bedtime stories when thunderstorms rattled the windows, was now branded a killer. She fled. The courthouse steps blurred beneath her feet, her heels echoing on the stone, chased by shouting voices and camera flashes that turned the world into a strobe-lit nightmare. She didn't stop running until she was locked inside her car, the engine off, her hands clenched around the steering wheel so tight her fingers cramped. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. Her reflection in the rearview mirror was someone she didn't recognize, eyes wide and red-rimmed, skin pale, and stretched too tight across her face. The headlines had already started scrolling across her phone screen. Killer cop sentenced to death. Victim's family weeps with relief. The comments were even worse. Rot in hell, Callahan. Like father, like daughter. Lock her up too. Hope they televise it. Her stomach lurched. She tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, her shaking hands pressed to her temples, trying to hold herself together as the world collapsed around her. That night, Samantha sat at her kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey half empty beside her, her laptop open, and every document from her father's case spread across the table like a map leading nowhere. It didn't add up. She'd combed through every scrap of evidence, every witness statement, every surveillance video. Something was wrong, a shadow in the corners that no one seemed willing to see. The DNA under the victim's nails wasn't fully processed, partially degraded, the report said. The gunshot residue, secondary transfer possible, but dismissed because it was unlikely. The security footage. The man ran with a limp her father didn't have. No one cared. The press wanted a story. The public wanted a villain, a hero cop gone bad. But Samantha knew her father, knew him down to the marrow of his bones. This wasn't him. The whiskey burned her throat as she took another swig, her fingers shaking as she refreshed her inbox for the 10th time that hour. Nothing. No new leads, no anonymous tips, no Hail Mary saving grace. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. Heart pounding, she answered. Stop digging, a voice rasped. Metallic, filtered, distorted. Her heart nearly stopped. Who is this? Stop looking, little Callahan, or your father won't be the only one dying this week. The line went dead. The phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the table. Her hands were ice cold, trembling as a rush of nausea swept through her. Her mind reeled. Someone was watching her. Someone knew what she was doing. The case against her father wasn't just flawed, it was deliberate. And now, they were coming for her. She didn't sleep. The hours dragged into dawn, her mind racing through every name, every face from the trial, from her father's cases. Who had they crossed? Who had a reason to want him gone? And why frame him for a political assassination? By the time the sun rose, a new resolve had settled in her bones. Samantha Callahan wasn't going to sit back and watch her father die for someone else's crime. If no one else would save him, she would. She didn't know how, not yet, but she would find a way, even if she had to break him out of prison herself. A daughter's desperation. The sky was still dark when Samantha Callahan stood at her father's front door, the house she'd grown up in, now cold and silent. A thin layer of dust coated the shelves and picture frames. The mail piled inside the door held nothing but late notices, subpoenas, and condolences from people who didn't know what else to say. She used to feel safe here, safe enough to leave her window open at night, to let the summer air drift in, carrying the scent of honeysuckle and the sound of crickets. Now, every creak in the floorboards made her heart hammer. Every shadow outside the window made her reach for the kitchen knife tucked into her waistband. Her father had built this place. Every piece of wood, every nail, chosen with care. A home, he'd called it, a fortress for their little family after her mother died. The man who had protected this house, this city, for more than 2 decades was now locked in a cell, waiting to die for a crime Samantha knew he hadn't committed. She wouldn't let it happen, no matter the cost. At the kitchen table, she laid out the map of Greystone Correctional Facility, smoothing it with shaking hands. Her father's handwriting filled the margins. He'd taught her how to read blueprints, how to see more than walls and doors. He called it thinking like a rat, finding the unseen paths, the weak spots no one noticed. Even now, her fingers traced those notes. South corridor camera has blind spot. Refresh rate 6 seconds. Utility doors wired to main power, but secondary panel at east wing. Staff entrance badge swipes don't trigger alerts unless used after midnight. She'd read it so many times the paper was soft as cloth. And yet, as much as she wanted to believe in the plan forming in her mind, Her hand still shook. She wasn't her father. She was just Samantha, the daughter of a man the world now called a murderer. But then she remembered the phone call. "Stop digging, or your father won't be the only one dying this week." That voice haunted her, replaying in her mind until it scraped against her sanity. Whoever they were powerful enough to frame her father. They were powerful enough to kill a city councilman, manipulate evidence, and silence anyone who stood in their way. That left her with only two choices: let them win and watch her father die, or do the unthinkable. She reached for her backpack. Inside was everything she gathered over the last week. A stolen corrections officer uniform swiped from a dry cleaner, a burner phone with encrypted messaging apps, a police-issue stun gun she bought from a shady contact in a parking lot, and a small photo of her and her dad, his arm around her shoulders, the two of them grinning at her college graduation. He didn't raise you to break the law. She could almost hear his voice in her head, calm but firm. But he did raise you to fight for what's right. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly. 23 hours left until her father's execution. She couldn't wait for evidence, or appeals, or justice to sort itself out. Justice was slow. Corruption was fast. Samantha Callahan was out of time. The wind bit at her face as she stood at the edge of the prison perimeter. Greystone Correctional loomed in front of her, a monolith of concrete and razor wire. Floodlights swept the grounds, cutting through the darkness, while armed guards patrolled in pairs. The main entrance was a fortress of reinforced steel and bulletproof glass. No way in. Not that way. She hadn't been here since her father's sentencing hearing, when they transferred him through those very gates, shackled and silent. He hadn't even turned to look at her when the doors swallowed him whole. That image burned in her mind, fueling the reckless courage that drove her forward. She pulled the stolen uniform over her jeans and shirt. It was a size too big, the sleeves hanging loose, but it would have to do. She pulled her hair into a tight bun, slipped on a black cap, and slid the ID badge, cobbled together from old employee photos she'd hacked off the prison's unsecured server, into her chest pocket. Her fingers brushed the stun gun at her hip, the cold plastic reassuring against her palm. The plan was simple, or at least it had to be. Infiltrate. Find the evidence she needed to prove her father's innocence. Get him out. If all else failed, she would get him out anyway. The side entrance, marked deliveries only, was her best chance. At 3:42 a.m., the only deliveries were from a sanitation crew clearing food waste from the kitchens. Samantha had spent 2 nights watching the rotation, learning the guards' names and the gaps in the schedule. The man stationed there tonight was Officer Kyle Renton, a mid-40s guard with a gut hanging over his belt and a habit of stepping outside for a smoke every 15 minutes. She'd even seen him sneak a beer from a cooler in his trunk once. Renton barely glanced at her as she approached. He was too busy scrolling through his phone, laughing at something on the screen. She flashed the fake badge, mumbled something about kitchen inventory, and slipped past him without so much as a second glance. In. The hallway smelled like bleach and stale grease. Her shoes squeaked on the tile, echoing too loudly for her liking. Every door was locked. Every camera a potential death sentence. But Samantha had spent weeks studying her father's notes. She knew where the blind spots were. Her first stop was the evidence archive. If the frame job was as thorough as she suspected, there'd be something there, something that didn't belong. Her father always said, "The truth hides in the details they don't expect anyone to see." The lock was a keypad. She took a deep breath and punched in the code, one she'd found scrawled in an internal memo buried in a court filing. 3-1-7-6. The door clicked open. Inside, rows of shelves stretched into darkness, each box labeled with case numbers. Samantha's fingers trembled as she traced them, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. She found the box marked Porter Homicide, case 77,204. She flipped the lid and found what she expected. Her father's confiscated service weapon, the blood-stained clothes, the grainy photo from the alley. But beneath those, something else. A file folder stamped QONFIDENTIL. Her breath caught as she opened it. Inside were surveillance logs from a private security firm. They showed Councilman Porter meeting with someone 2 days before the murder. Someone whose face was blacked out, but whose height and build were unmistakable. Police Chief Robert Kincaid. Samantha's stomach turned. Chief Kincaid had been the first to condemn her father, holding press conferences calling him a disgrace to the badge. He pushed for the death penalty. He was the real target all along. Samantha's mind raced, her fingers shaking as she snapped photos of every page, sending them to the burner phone in her pocket. Suddenly, footsteps outside the door. Heavy, coming closer. She barely had time to shove the files back into the box before the handle turned. Renton. He squinted at her. "What the hell are you doing in here?" Her mind scrambled for a lie, but her fingers were faster. They grabbed the stun gun, firing into his gut before he could even reach for his radio. He crumpled to the floor, convulsing silently. Her heart pounded so loudly, she thought it might shake the shelves. No turning back now. She slipped out, leaving Renton groaning behind her. Her time was running out. If she was going to save her father, it had to be tonight. And if that meant breaking him out of prison with her own 2 hands, then so be it. The prison walls bleed secrets. Samantha's hands still shook as she slipped through the dimly lit corridor, the echoes of her own footsteps chasing her like phantoms. Renton lay unconscious behind her, the stun gun still warm in her grip. Her breath came fast and shallow, each inhale scraping her lungs like sandpaper. Her plan, if she could even call it that, had splintered the moment she fired that first jolt of electricity into the guard's gut. There was no more pretending, no more blending into the background. She wasn't a shadow anymore. She was a fugitive inside a fortress built to hold men like her father. Each heartbeat pulsed in her ears like a ticking clock. 22 hours until his execution. Her father's notes were burned into her mind. All the little tricks and observations from his years walking these halls as a visiting detective. Blind spots, patrol rotations, broken door sensors no one had ever fixed. Samantha crept along the West Wing corridor, ducking under the flickering eye of a malfunctioning security camera her father had mentioned in one of his scribbled side notes. The hall smelled like stale sweat, disinfectant, and hopelessness. The air itself felt heavy, saturated with the weight of too many stories cut short. Cell Block D, death row. Her father's block. It was the furthest from the administrative offices, isolated like a tumor no one wanted to touch. The corridor leading to it was lined with thick steel doors, some reinforced with secondary bars. Each one housed men whose names were already carved into gravestones, whether they were guilty or not. Her father was somewhere down this hall, in a 6x8 cage, waiting to die. She couldn't let herself think about that. Not yet, not with so much left to do. The guard station stood ahead, a narrow room with bulletproof glass windows and a reinforced metal desk. Inside, a lone officer sat with his feet propped up on the desk, headphones in, nodding along to some distant beat. He never saw her coming. Samantha slipped behind him, the stun gun buzzing as she pressed it to the soft spot just above his collarbone. His body seized violently, arms flailing before slumping forward with a grunt. She caught him under the arms, lowering him as quietly as possible to the floor. His ID badge, clipped to his belt, caught the dim light. J. Collins, senior guard. She swiped it, sliding it into her own pocket before grabbing the ring of keys on his desk. The access system had been upgraded years earlier, a half-baked hybrid of physical keys and digital locks, the kind of patchwork system that only underfunded state facilities could dream up. She rifled through a list taped beside the monitor. Cell D12, Callahan, Ethan. Her heart leaked into her throat. She was so close. The hallway stretched on endlessly, every door identical except for the small brass numbers bolted to their frames. She passed D04, D05, D06, counting under her breath until she reached key 12. Her hands shook so badly she dropped the keys twice before she could slide the right one into the lock. The bolt groaned, rust and grime grinding against metal as it turned. The door swung open. There he was, her father. Ethan Callahan sat on the edge of his narrow cot, his elbows resting on his knees, his fingers steepled under his chin. His head snapped up at the sound of the door opening, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Samantha." His voice was hoarse, cracked from disuse. She couldn't speak. Her throat closed tight, her vision blurred, and before she could stop herself, she was across the room, wrapping her arms around him. His frame was thinner than she remembered, all sharp edges and wiry muscle, but the familiar scent of soap and steel beneath the prison stench grounded her. "What the hell are you doing here?" His voice was equal parts fear and awe. "You can't. How did you?" "I'm getting you out," she whispered fiercely, her fingers gripping the rough fabric of his prison shirt. "I found something, Dad. It's bigger than we thought." His hands closed around her shoulders, gently pushing her back to arm's length. "You shouldn't be here. This place will chew you up." "I don't care," she snapped, tears burning her eyes. "They're killing you tomorrow, and no one's coming to save you. I'm all you've got." For a moment, the weight of it all pressed down on them, the enormity of what she was doing reflected in her father's storm-cloud eyes. "Then we move fast," he said quietly, slipping into the mode she recognized. The cop, the tactician, the man who had taught her how to drive, how to spot a tail, how to fight with her elbows when her fists wouldn't do. They moved together, silent and precise, each step carved from adrenaline and instinct. Samantha led the way, tracing the path she'd memorized from the stolen blueprints, her father at her back. Every door, every corridor was a gauntlet. They ducked behind a laundry cart when two guards passed, their footsteps heavy and careless. Samantha's fingers found her stun gun again, the plastic warm against her palm. Her father carried nothing but his fists and the weight of 20 years of training, and a year of waiting for a needle to end his life. The control room was their next target, the nerve center where camera feeds, electronic locks, and perimeter alarms were managed. If they could cut the feed and trigger a secondary system loop, they'd buy themselves minutes. Just minutes, but sometimes minutes made the difference between life and death. Samantha swiped Colin's stolen badge at the control room door. The red light blinked green. They slipped inside. A wall of monitors stretched across the room, each screen a patchwork view of the prison. Cells, hallways, yards, kitchens. Samantha's own blurry figure appeared briefly on one feed before the camera swung away, oblivious. Her father moved to the console, fingers flying over keys and buttons. "Still remember this old junk system," he muttered, typing in a sequence she didn't recognize. The screens flickered, then froze. "Camera loop activated," he said, a grim smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, "just like the old surveillance vans. They'll think everything's fine. For now." A flashing alert caught Samantha's eye on one of the screens. "Security breach. West Wing." "They found Renton," she whispered. "No time to waste," her father said, already moving toward the door. They sprinted through the empty halls, the building eerily silent. The kind of silence that only exists in places meant to contain the dead or the soon-to-be dead. Every shadow felt like a threat, every corner a potential ambush. The final gate, the service exit, loomed ahead. A keypad controlled it, but it was old, barely functional. Ethan dropped to one knee, pried the panel open with a pen from Samantha's pocket, and twisted two wires together. The door slid open with a groan. Alarms erupted immediately. "Move," Ethan shouted. They burst into the cool night air, the sky a pale shade of pre-dawn gray. The grass was slick with dew, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and exhaust. Floodlights snapped on, bathing the yard in harsh white light. Behind them, shouting voices, flashlights spotting. Samantha's heart pounded, her father's grip tight on her wrist as they ran. Two fugitives, bound by blood and desperation. The chain-link fence at the perimeter was topped with razor wire, but near the east loading dock, the fence sagged. Her father's notes had been right. They climbed together, ignoring the scrape of metal against skin, the tearing of clothes. They hit the ground running. Behind them, alarms blared, searchlights combed the grass, and the walls of Greystone Correctional faded into the dark. Ahead lay the forest, dark, thick, and unknown. They vanished into it together. For now, they were free. For now, into the fire. The forest swallowed them whole. The brambles clawed at Samantha's legs as she stumbled through the underbrush, her breath ragged, her hands still slick with sweat and the grime of the prison. Her father was just ahead, his pace steady despite the exhaustion she knew had to be coursing through his body. Behind them, the prison sirens howled into the night, a relentless scream that seemed to seep into the very air, warning the world that a convicted murderer had slipped through the cracks. No, not a murderer. Her father. Ethan Callahan moved like a ghost, weaving through the trees, sticking to shadows even though there was no real pursuit. Yet, his training showed in every step. His head stayed low, his ears tuned to every crackling twig and distant engine rumble. "Where are we going?" Samantha panted, her lungs burning with every breath. "Safe house," Ethan murmured over his shoulder. "West of the ridge. Old contact set it up when I first got arrested. Just in case. Just in case you got framed for murder and had to break out of prison," Samantha said, her voice sharper than she intended. Fear made her brittle. "That's a hell of a contingency plan, Dad." He stopped abruptly, spinning to face her. In the pale moonlight, his face was stark, hollowed by months in confinement, jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out beneath his skin. "You always prepare for the worst," he said softly. "Because if you don't, the worst comes anyway." She couldn't argue with that. The worst had come for them both. They walked in silence after that, weaving through thick underbrush and rocky gullies. The night air was heavy with moisture, clinging to their clothes, their skin, their lungs. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a lonely sound cutting through the darkness. Samantha's mind raced with every step. The folder she'd stolen from the evidence room, those blacked-out names, the half-shredded reports, the surveillance footage showing her father wasn't even in the right quadrant when Councilman Porter was killed. It had been enough to convince her that someone powerful wanted Ethan gone. But why? She knew her father had enemies. Dirty cops, gang leaders, politicians whose secrets he'd uncovered and never made public. But a full-frame job, planted evidence, a coordinated smear campaign. That wasn't just revenge. That was cover-up on a scale she couldn't fully grasp yet. When the trees thinned and the small cabin came into view, Samantha almost collapsed with relief. It was barely more than a shack. Weathered wood, a sagging roof, and a narrow porch held together by prayers and rusty nails. But it was shelter. And for tonight, shelter was everything. Ethan pushed open the door without a word, the ancient hinges screeching loud enough to make Samantha wince. Inside, the air smelled like damp wood and stale cigarettes. A single cot stood against the far wall, a dusty table cluttered with empty cans and a propane lantern. "How do you know no one's watching this place?" Samantha asked, peeling off her jacket and rubbing at the scratches on her arms. "Because the guy who set it up disappeared 6 months ago." Ethan's tone was flat, emotionless. "Figured either he ran, or someone made him disappear." "Perfect." Samantha slumped onto the cot, exhaustion finally crashing into her like a freight train. Her limbs felt like sandbags, her mind foggy with adrenaline withdrawal. Ethan moved to the window, parting the threadbare curtain just enough to scan the woods outside. His silhouette was gaunt, his shoulders still too straight, like he hadn't realized he wasn't a cop anymore. "We can't stay long," he said. "They'll have every cop in the state looking for us by morning. They'll assume we're headed for the border." "We're not." "No." Ethan turned, his expression unreadable. We're going back. Samantha sat bolt upright. Back where? To Greystone. Are you insane? Not the prison. Ethan sat at the table, fingers drumming against the worn wood. To the people who put me there. The words hung between them like smoke, filling the room with their weight. You know who framed you. It wasn't a question. I have a pretty good idea. Ethan's jaw worked, grinding invisible stones between his teeth. Chief Robert Kincaid. He was dirty long before I found out about it. The name punched the air from Samantha's lungs. Kincaid. He was the one leading the press conferences. He stood at Mum's funeral. He gave me my scholarship check when I started college. Yeah. Ethan's smile was razor-sharp and humorless, and he's also been skimming from federal grants, laundering money through shell charities, and covering for a network of dirty cops who've been running their own little fiefdom inside the department. Samantha felt like she was falling even though she was sitting still. Why not go public? Her voice was thin, frayed at the edges. If you knew, why not blow the whistle? Because I didn't have proof, Ethan said. Not enough. I was building a case, quietly. Then Porter got murdered, and suddenly every piece of evidence pointed at me. They needed a scapegoat. Samantha's voice was a whisper. They needed to bury me, Ethan corrected. And they needed someone the public would turn on fast. A decorated cop. That's a headline. Samantha ran a hand through her tangled hair, her mind spinning. How deep does this go? She asked. Deeper than either of us wants to know, Ethan said grimly. And if we don't pull every rotten thread out into the light, they'll bury us both before the week's over. The enormity of it settled in her chest like wet cement. Her father's freedom wasn't just a matter of proving innocence. They were up against an entire system. Cops, judges, politicians, all woven into a knot of corruption that wouldn't unravel without a fight. Then we need allies, Samantha said, her voice firmer than she felt. People who won't fold the second the pressure hits. Ethan's expression darkened. I don't have many of those left. What about Captain Reyes? Samantha remembered the wiry woman with the sharp wit and sharper temper, the only superior her father had ever respected. Ethan hesitated. Maybe. Then she's our first call. Samantha stood, her legs shaking from fatigue. We'll need gear, safe transport, contacts in the press who won't just spin whatever story Kincaid feeds them. Ethan's smile was small but real. You've been thinking about this. I've been living it. Samantha stepped closer, laying a hand on his arm. We'll clear your name, Dad, even if we have to burn the whole damn department down to do it. Ethan covered her hand with his own, his grip still strong despite the months of confinement. Then we start at dawn, he said. Samantha squeezed his hand. Together. They slept in shifts, both too wired and too hunted to fully let go. Samantha's dreams were a slurry of prison alarms, headlines screaming killer cop, and memories of her father teaching her to ride a bike in this very forest when she was 6. When dawn broke, gray and cold, they were already packing. Samantha's burner phone pinged with a single message. From unknown. Meet me at Caldwell Bridge. Sunrise. Bring Ethan. Her stomach nodded. Who sent that? Ethan asked, peering over her shoulder. No idea. Samantha chewed her lip. But if someone's willing to risk meeting us in person. They either want to help us, Ethan said, or they want to finish the job. They stood at the threshold of the cabin, the sun slicing through the mist like a knife. They were outlaws now, but together. And together, they would burn the whole corrupt machine to the ground. The bridge between lies and truth. The early morning fog clung low to the asphalt, curling like ghostly fingers around the rusted steel beams of Caldwell Bridge. The sun was still rising, its weak light filtering through skeletal branches and painting the cracked pavement in a muted silver haze. Samantha stood beside her father, her hands jammed into her jacket pockets to hide the trembling. The cold had nothing to do with it. Fear was a living thing under her skin now, thrumming in her veins, gnawing at her edges. Every step closer to the truth felt like stepping onto a frozen lake, the ice cracking louder beneath her feet. And now, they were walking straight into a meeting with someone who might either save them or put a bullet in their skulls. Whoever this is, they knew we'd be on the run. Ethan murmured beside her, his voice low and wary. His eyes scanned the horizon, his posture tense even in the quiet. Maybe it's a reporter, Samantha said, though she didn't believe it. Or someone who knew you were set up. Or it's a trap, Ethan countered, his hand brushing the stolen handgun tucked into the waistband of his jeans. Either way, we're about to find out. The gravel shoulder crunched under their boots as they approached the center of the bridge. It was an old structure, once part of a state highway before the newer bypass made it obsolete. Now it was a skeleton. Unused, unloved, a meeting place for the desperate and the hunted. A single figure stood near the railing, back to them, hands resting on the corroded metal. Samantha's stomach flipped as they drew closer, her mind running through every possible identity. A disgraced cop, a remorseful witness, someone from her father's past who still owed him a favor. Then the figure turned, and Samantha's breath caught. It was Captain Andrea Reyes. Ethan froze beside her, his fists clenched, his jaw tight with conflicting emotions. Captain Reyes had been his superior, his mentor in the department, the only person he'd ever trusted completely. Now she was here, waiting for them in the half-light, her expression as unreadable as ever. Jesus Christ, Ethan exhaled. Andrea. Reyes gave a tired smile, the corners of her mouth barely twitching. You always were a stubborn bastard, Ethan. Her voice carried no warmth, only exhaustion, the kind that came from fighting a system too big to beat. Samantha stepped forward, her heart still hammering in her chest. Why are you here? Reyes' gaze flicked to her, then back to Ethan. Because I owed you more than silence. Ethan's face darkened. You knew. Reyes nodded once. Not everything, but enough. Enough to know you were being framed. Enough to know if I tried to help you back then, they'd bury me right next to you. Samantha's stomach churned with a sick mix of rage and hope. So why now? Why stick your neck out now? Reyes' shoulders sagged slightly, as if the weight of her guilt had finally broken something inside her. Because I'm dying. Her voice was calm, matter-of-fact, like she was reading off a grocery list. Stage 4. They gave me 6 months. Figured I'd spend what's left doing something useful. The words landed like stones in Samantha's gut, but Ethan didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on Reyes, measuring every word, every flicker of her expression. So you're here to confess. Ethan's voice was sharp. Or to help us clear my name. Both, Reyes said. I'm the one who buried the first report. The one that placed you nowhere near Porter's murder scene. Kincaid gave me a choice. Fake the timeline or lose my badge, my pension, and probably my life. I chose wrong. Ethan's hands curled into fists at his sides, the veins in his forearms standing out like cords. You let me rot in a cell. I did, Reyes admitted, her voice cracking just slightly. And I'll live with that. What's left of my life anyway. But I'm not leaving you alone in this fight now. Samantha stepped closer, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound in control. What do you know about the people behind this? Not just Kincaid. Everyone. Reyes' expression darkened. It's bigger than you think. Kincaid's just a middleman. The real power, the people who ordered Porter's murder and framed Ethan, they're tied to Project Meadowfall. The name meant nothing to Samantha, but her father's face went pale. That's not possible, Ethan muttered, shaking his head. Meadowfall was shut down a decade ago. What was Meadowfall? Samantha demanded, her gaze bouncing between them. Reyes' lips pressed into a thin line. It was a covert task force. Off books. A mix of federal and local agents used to handle problems when official channels were too slow. Surveillance. Blackmail. Occasionally. Removal. Removal. Samantha's stomach twisted. Hits, Ethan said quietly. State-sponsored assassinations under the guise of public safety. Targets were politicians, judges, reporters, anyone who threatened the wrong people. Samantha's breath caught. "And Porter?" "Porter had a file on Meadowfall," Ray said. "A file your father was close to finding. Someone higher up decided it was easier to take Porter out and make Ethan the fall guy." "Who?" Ethan demanded, his voice a low growl. "Who gave the order?" Rice hesitated, not because she didn't know, but because saying the name out loud carried weight. "And danger." Finally, she said it. "Deputy Attorney General William Trask." Samantha's heart dropped. Trask wasn't just powerful, he was untouchable. A career prosecutor with deep ties to law enforcement unions, intelligence agencies, and politicians across both parties. Trask was the man they paraded out at press conferences to talk about ethics, integrity, and the importance of upholding the law. And now, he was the one pulling the strings that had nearly gotten her father executed. "We have to expose him," Samantha said, her voice shaking with equal parts fear and fury. "We have to show the world what he's done." Ray shook her head. "You don't expose men like Trask. Not with a press release, not with a tweet. The only way you take him down is with something so damning, so airtight, even his allies can't cover for him." "Like what?" Ethan's voice was flat. "Meadowfall's Black Ledger," Ray said. "It's the master list. Targets, payments, sign-offs. It's the only proof that ties Trask directly to every illegal op Meadowfall ran." "Where is it?" Samantha asked, her heart pounding. Ray's mouth twisted into something halfway between a smile and a grimace. "That's the bad news. It's stored in a secure vault at the Department of Justice Field office downtown." Samantha's breath caught. "That building's a fortress." "Yeah." Ray's met her eyes. "But I know a back door." Ethan's jaw clenched. "This is suicide." "So was letting them kill you," Samantha shot back. "We either take this risk, or we run for the rest of our lives." The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the distant sound of traffic far below the bridge. Finally, Ethan nodded. "When do we move?" Ray's gaze drifted to the horizon, the rising sun casting its golden light over the decaying steel beams. "Tonight," she said softly, "before Trask realizes I've switched sides." Samantha took her father's hand, squeezing tight enough to ground herself. They were walking straight into the fire. But this time, they weren't alone. The Ledger of the Damned. The black asphalt shimmered under the halogen streetlights outside the Federal Justice Complex, a towering slab of concrete and glass that loomed over the city like a monument to unearned power. Samantha stood across the street, her heart pounding so loudly it threatened to drown out the world around her. Beside her, Ethan stood with his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his stolen jacket, his jaw set, his face grim. Captain Rice leaned against the crumbling brick wall behind them, her breath shallow, her face paler than it had been at the bridge. "You sure you can do this?" Samantha whispered, her eyes flicking toward the older woman. "Stage 4, Rice murmured. "There's nothing they can threaten me with anymore." Her lips curled into a faint, tired smile. "Besides, you and your old man could use someone who knows which doors don't set off alarms." Ethan snorted softly. "You always were a stubborn pain in the ass." Ray's smile didn't fade. "Takes one to know one." Samantha exhaled sharply, trying to calm her nerves. "All right," she said, her voice low but firm. "One last time. Walk me through it." Ray straightened, shifting from weary into professional with the kind of ease only a career officer could manage. "The Black Ledger is kept in the lower archive vault, sublevel 2. The vault's on a rotating security cycle, meaning the door code changes every 24 hours. But the real obstacle isn't the door." "What is it?" Samantha asked. "The vault is wired to the internal fail-safe system. If any unauthorized person accesses it, the building goes into full lockdown. Steel blast doors, reinforced shutters. You'll be trapped inside." Samantha swallowed hard. So we need the code and authorization. No, Reyes said, a wicked glint in her eye. We need to convince the system that we're supposed to be there. How? Ethan asked. By piggybacking on someone else's credentials. Reyes held up a small device, no bigger than a pack of gum. A black plastic dongle with a blinking green light. This is a handshake clone. As soon as we get close enough to a DOJ officer with high clearance, it'll copy their key signature and spoof their credentials long enough to trick the system. Samantha's brow furrowed. That's a lot more high-tech than I expected from someone working out of a shack. Reyes shrugged. Old contacts. You spend long enough in the swamp, you meet all kinds. Ethan stepped forward, eyeing the device. That gets us in the vault. What gets us out? Reyes' smile faded. That's where it gets messy. We have to trigger a fire suppression drill, real enough to force them to evacuate the building, but not enough to call in the feds immediately. Samantha's stomach twisted. A fake fire alarm. No, Reyes said. We'd release a trace chemical agent, harmless in small doses, but enough to trigger their hazardous materials protocol. They'll evacuate, we blend in with the evacuees, and we walk out with the ledger. And if they catch us? Ethan asked. Reyes' smile was thin. They'll kill us before we see a courtroom. Samantha's fingers curled into fists at her sides. The enormity of what they were about to do hung heavy in the air. But after everything they'd lost, there was no turning back. Let's move, Ethan said. Inside the fortress. The lobby of the Federal Justice Complex was a cold, sterile expanse of marble floors and chrome accents. Security guards stood at the entrance, eyes scanning every visitor who passed through the doors, their hands resting casually on holstered sidearms. Samantha's palms were clammy inside her leather gloves. The stolen DOJ credentials clipped to her jacket were genuine. Borrowed from a real employee Reyes knew who owed her a favor. But if anyone looked too closely, they were dead. Ethan walked slightly ahead, his shoulders straight, his face locked into the expression Samantha remembered from childhood. The face he wore when nothing could be allowed to break through. The face of a man hiding the storm inside. They'd reached the security checkpoint. A board guard, barely out of his 20s, glanced at their badges and waved them through without much more than a grunt. Reyes was already inside, having entered an hour earlier under the guise of a building inspector reviewing structural work in the lower levels. They met her at the service elevator, the narrow space barely large enough for all three of them. Sublevel 2, Reyes said, tapping the button with a shaky hand. Her skin was damp with sweat, her breathing slightly labored. You okay? Samantha asked softly. Fine, Reyes said. Just, let's get it done. The elevator shuddered to life, descending with a low hum. Samantha's heart pounded with each passing floor. By the time the doors slid open, her knees were weak. The sublevel was colder than the rest of the building, the concrete walls sweating condensation. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, buzzing faintly. Reyes pulled out the handshake clone, the green light blinking faster. We're close, she whispered. They rounded the corner and found him. A DOJ officer in his late 50s, balding, carrying a stack of files. His clearance badge swung from a lanyard around his neck, the high-tier gold stripe standing out even in the dim light. As he passed, Reyes nudged Samantha forward. Samantha stumbled, just slightly, bumping into the officer's shoulder. Oh, sorry, she said, her voice pitched higher than normal. Her fingers brushed his lanyard for a fraction of a second. The handshake clone blinked blue. Watch where you're going, the man grumbled, but he kept walking. Reyes grinned. Got it. The vault door loomed ahead, a heavy steel monstrosity set into the wall like a tombstone. A small terminal glowed beside it, waiting for credentials. Reyes plugged in the handshake clone. The screen flashed, then displayed. Kiliorantc HCCPT NTTER AXCSKOD. Reyes' smile faltered. Damn it. What? Samantha whispered. This clearance requires a biometric scan, palm print. Whose? Ethan asked. Reyes glanced back toward the hallway, where the DOJ officer had disappeared. His. Samantha's stomach sank. We need his hand. Only for 5 seconds, Reyes said. We just have to get him back here. Ethan exhaled sharply. I'll handle it. He disappeared down the hall. Samantha waited, pulse hammering in her ears. Seconds ticked by, stretching into minutes. Then Ethan reappeared. The officer in tow, muttering complaints about technical issues, while Ethan nodded along sympathetically. The officer placed his palm on the scanner. The screen turned green. Thank you for your cooperation, Reyes said smoothly, smiling her best official smile. The officer left, none the wiser. The vault door groaned, gears grinding as the massive slab slid open. The air inside was cold and stale, the scent of paper, metal, and something chemical hanging in the air. Rows of file cabinets stretched into the distance, and there, in the center, a single reinforced safe. Reyes approached it, entering the freshly cloned code. The door swung open. Inside sat a single black binder, plain, unmarked. Samantha's fingers trembled as she lifted it free, the weight of every crime, every cover-up, every murder sinking into her hands. Meadow Falls ledger. They'd found it. Then the fire alarm blared. Red lights strobed the room, and a mechanical voice boomed through the speakers. Hazard detected. Evacuation required. All personnel report to emergency exits. It worked, Reyes said breathlessly. Samantha clutched the ledger to her chest as they followed the evacuation flow, blending into the stream of employees filing toward the exits. They were almost free. Almost. Then Samantha felt it, a hand closing around her wrist, hard and cold. She spun, heart freezing in her chest. Deputy Attorney General William Trask stood behind her, his smile thin as a blade. Going somewhere, Miss Callahan. The cost of truth. Samantha's breath caught in her throat as Deputy Attorney General William Trask tightened his grip on her wrist, his fingers like iron clamps digging into her skin. His smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. You didn't really think you could walk out of here with my secrets, did you? Trask's voice was soft, almost polite, the way a predator might speak to prey right before the kill. Ethan's gun was out in a flash, the barrel aimed square at Trask's head. Let her go. Trask didn't flinch. Go ahead, Callahan. Shoot me. But the second you do, every guard in this building will be on you before you can count to 3. Behind Trask, Reyes staggered slightly, her hand pressed to her stomach. Sweat beaded on her brow, her breathing shallow. She was running out of time. And they all knew it. Do it, Reyes croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. Put him down. Trask's smile widened. I wouldn't listen to her if I were you. After all, she's the one who covered for me for years. Didn't she tell you that? Ethan's hand shook slightly, but the barrel stayed level. I know. And I also know you're the reason I spent the last year waiting to die. Trask's grip on Samantha loosened just enough for her to twist free. She stumbled back, holding the black ledger tight to her chest. The sun was warm on the back of Samantha's neck as she stood at the edge of the small cemetery. The air smelled like grass and honeysuckle, just like it had when she was a kid. The kind of day that would have been perfect for a picnic or a lazy afternoon with no worries beyond whether her dad would let her have ice cream before dinner. Captain Ray's casket stood at the edge of the grave, a folded flag resting on top. There were no crowds, just Samantha, Ethan, and a handful of old colleagues who had come to pay their respects. She knew what was coming, Ethan said quietly, standing beside his daughter. But she didn't run. Samantha's fingers brushed the folded flag. She said she wanted to do one good thing before the end. You were that good thing, Ethan said. We both were. They stood in silence for a long time, until the funeral director gave a polite nod, signaling it was time. The casket was lowered into the earth, and the first shovelful of dirt fell with a soft, final sound. Reyes was gone, But the fight she'd helped start wasn't over. 1 year later, the Hayes Foundation for Justice held its first annual gala in the same ballroom where Trask had once delivered speeches about honor and integrity. Now his name was a cautionary tale, a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the truth. Samantha stood at the podium, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. "My father taught me that justice isn't something you wait for," she said. "It's something you fight for, even when the odds are impossible." The room erupted in applause. Among the guests were men and women the foundation had helped, people who had been wrongfully convicted, families who had found the truth because Samantha refused to stop digging. In the front row, Ethan sat with Jacob, Samantha's young son, on his knee. Jacob waved when she looked his way, his innocent smile lighting up the room. Her father's hand rested on Jacob's shoulder, steady and strong. They were whole again. As the applause faded, Samantha raised a glass. "To Captain Andrea Reyes," she said softly, "and to everyone who believed in the truth, even when it cost them everything." The room rose to their feet, glasses raised high. The cost had been steep, but the truth had won. And for Samantha Callahan, that was enough.